Politicians on both sides of the aisle are making headlines coming out against the new Florida curriculum for African American studies. Ron DeSantis has been a lightning rod for controversy over the last several years, and this continues that trend. However, most people have not stopped to ask what the curriculum actually says. Is it trying to push an agenda that slavery was somehow good or beneficial to those who were enslaved? Or is it seeking to praise the character and determination of the enslaved men and women by demonstrating their grit and their resilience? This has been all over the news lately. And most prominently, Vice President Kamala Harris has come out and has levied some heavy accusations over what's going on in Florida. This is a direct quote from the vice president. She said last week, in the state of Florida, they decided middle school students will be taught that enslaved people benefited from slavery. I think the way this is worded really, really matters. In the state of Florida, they decided middle school students will be taught that enslaved people benefited from slavery. In politics in general, I think we just have to be so careful. And it should be very concerning to all of us that the need for accuracy in our statements and in our public discourse just kind of seems to be non-existent. And there are just so many people jumping to conclusions and leaping to assumptions on both sides of the aisle. Tragically, you probably saw, this could have been a whole nother story, that Obama's personal chef died in a paddleboarding accident. And there are people all over the right who are trying to link this to Barack and Michelle Obama as if they killed this guy. Is there any evidence for that? No, there's not. So you just have to let processes play out. When it comes to this curriculum, if you want to comment on it, that's fine. I'm about to comment on it. But you should probably seek to find out what it actually says. Again, Kamala Harris said students will be taught enslaved people benefited from slavery, as if slavery was a good thing for them. Here's what the actual curriculum standards say. Instruction includes how slaves developed skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. Instruction includes how slaves develop skills, which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. Now, part of how you read this comes down to kind of your anthropology of how you actually see the world. There is a growing idea, and this is not a new idea. I mean, this goes back to Marxism, and Marx was influenced by many other philosophers and thinkers before his time. But the idea that the entire world is predicated on power and dominance hierarchies. And the people who have more power in any given culture are the oppressors. So in Marxism, what you have to understand is there's no category of a powerful person who wields their power for good. That is impossible on Marxism. If you have power on Marxism, then you're an oppressor, which means the only way you get your power is by oppressing people, and the only way you keep your power is by keeping other people oppressed. Now, is that the way the world actually functions? It's not. I mean, you can just look historically. You can look at economic trends. You can look at almost any factor and see that when good people give power, when competent people are given power, that typically a rising tide lifts all ships. That tends to be more of the way the world works. Marxism says a rising tide lifts a few ships and sinks the rest of them. It's a really bad way of looking at the world. And then the oppressors are just always oppressed, and there is nothing redemptive in that suffering or in that pain. Now, Marxism is distinctly anti-Christian. Because part of the Christian sentiment is what Jesus said: in this world, you will have trouble, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. The call that Jesus gave to actually follow after him is to follow after me. You deny yourself every day, and then you take up your cross. In other words, you bear up under the most suffering you can possibly handle on behalf of other people, and then you can follow the footsteps of Jesus. James, the half-brother of Jesus, actually told his church, the Jerusalem church, who had been scattered through persecution. They were running for their lives. They were hiding in the hills around Jerusalem. He said, consider it joy, brothers and sisters, when you encounter trials, suffering of various kinds, knowing that your trials will produce endurance. It will grow you, that there's purpose inside of pain. And I've done a lot of reading about the founding of our country. Part of what you also see when you actually look at the curriculum for Florida schools is that they are not very different than any other states, and that they are crystal clear on the horror and this original sin of our country, just the stain that we have to live with of slavery, and just how absolutely evil and abhorrent that it was. But something that's incredible to see when you read often the stories that came out of the antebellum South, when you read works like Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington, is you see exactly what the Florida curriculum is trying to point out, that as much as the enslaved slaves, as much as the slaves were oppressed and beaten down and just living under the thumb of evil, they had determination. They had grit. They built skill sets, not because of slavery, in spite of slavery. And that when slavery ended, many of them took those very skill sets and used it for their own personal benefit and the benefit of others in their lives. Here's what Booker T. Washington said: "I have learned that success is to be measured not so much by the position that one has reached in life as by the obstacles which he has overcome while trying to succeed." I'm going to read that again. Booker T. Washington, who grew up, he was, I think, 9 years old when the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. He said, "I've learned that success is to be measured not so much by the position that one has reached in life as by the obstacles which he has overcome while trying to succeed." In Israel's history, there was a time where they were overtaken by Babylon, and many of them were now captives in Babylon. And this is what Jeremiah wrote. He's speaking on behalf of the Lord. He says, "This is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says to all the exiles I deported from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Find wives for yourselves and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters to men in marriage, so they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease. Pursue the well-being of the city I've deported you to. Pray to the Lord on its behalf, for when it thrives, then you will thrive." Now, let me say up front, the situation in the antebellum South and the situation with the captives in Babylon, they were very different. They were very different. And yet we even see in the story of Israel's enslavement to Egypt, something that might be a little bit more of an analogy to one another, that the horrible conditions, I mean, unbelievable, they just started killing all the firstborn sons. That's the story of Moses. That when they're brought back into the promised land, that they took some of the skills that they shouldn't have had to develop, because slavery is terrible and evil, but they did develop them and they used them in the promised land. Joseph, who you might know as Joseph in the Coat of Many Colors, or if you're a fan of musicals, Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Joseph is sold into slavery. And that's how he starts his journey in life. And he allows himself to be used by God in that situation. Admitting the resilience of those being mistreated in no way absolves the oppressors of wrongdoing. Let me say that again. Admitting the resilience of those being mistreated in no way absolves the oppressors of wrongdoing. If anything, it highlights the oppressor's absolute cruelty while magnifying the character of those who were made victims. This is what the curriculum in Florida is trying to say. It is not lowering the stature of those who were enslaved. It is not trying to rewrite history as if slavery is some great thing that benefited them because they learned some sharecropping skills or some blacksmithing skills. What it's saying is, despite the absolute horror and evil of slavery, look at the incredible tenacity and spirit and the soul of these men and women who, even in the midst of all of that, built skill sets that allowed them to build lives once we finally emancipated those slaves and allowed them to come under the promise of our country, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all people, because all people are created and endowed by their creator with those very inalienable rights. And so, far from belittling the efforts or the situation of slaves in the antebellum South, it is shining a spotlight on their just impeccable character and their tenacity. And so I think we've got to start being honest. When we have the vice president completely mishandling, and so let's ascribe the best intentions possible. Maybe she really believes that. Maybe her people, because the vice president and president, they got a lot of people, right? They don't write their own speeches. They've got people for that. Maybe they really misunderstood that, or maybe somewhere down the line, they decided it would be politically expedient to kind of twist it a little bit to make Florida look bad. However it got there, maybe she really believes this is what's being taught in Florida. And if that is what was going to be taught in Florida, we should all stand against that. We should not be okay with the whitewashing of our history. If you want to repeat history, all you got to do is forget it. We should not forget where we came from. We should not forget what happens when we segregate ourselves out by immutable characteristics. We should not forget the evil that lies in the heart of man and how quickly things can turn. We should not forget that. But again, remembering that, we can remember how it actually took place, and admitting that the people who were enslaved were resilient and powerful and able to find meaning in their lives and able to lift each other up and able to stay in tight community with one another and able to fight for each other. All of these things that you read about, if you really spend time reading about what happened back then, admitting their incredible characters, their hearts and their souls in no way absolves the oppressors. And it just highlights the power of those people who are in the worst situation imaginable.